There may come a time when you and I might want to have a single subnet to support a lot of different devices, but at the same time control the interaction on that same subnet between those devices. Well, fortunately, to help enforce that at layer 2, we can use this really cool technique called private VLANs. I'd like you to imagine in your mind a beautiful island. And on this island, a lot of people come for vacation purposes. Now, not every single person is the same on these vacations. For example, there are some people that want to go on vacation and they want to be by themselves. And so what they do, they take their boat, they arrive at the island, at the dock, and then they go to a place in the island that's isolated. Now, it's isolated from everybody else. So let's say there's 4 or 5 different people who all want to go to the island. So, for example, this is person 1 and this is person 2. They can all go to the island and they can all go to separate locations on that island where they will be isolated from everybody else. So person 1 and person 2 won't ever see each other on the island. However, they will have access to the dock so they can get on the boat and leave the island if they need to. Another group of people may want to go to the island, but they may want to go as a group. So let's call this group Group A or Community A, a community of people. So they arrive at the docks, and then they go ahead and they use this part of the island. So the cool thing about being a community is that person 1, 2, and 3 in that community can all see each other. They can hang out and they can have a good time. So they're all here in this same community, Community A. And of course, Community A has access to the docks so they can leave the island. Now, what about these isolated people over here? They don't want anybody from Community A or anybody else who's isolated to ever come in contact with them. So based on how we set this up, we would make sure that Community A would never have any contact with anybody in one of our isolated portions of the island. And the same thing holds true for Community B. We could have additional users. Wow, this yellow is yellow, isn't it? And Community B would show up at the docks. They could go down and be in an area of Community B. And Community B people could see each other, and they'd have access to the dock, but they wouldn't have access to anyone in Community A, nor would they have any access to anyone who is part of the isolated area of the island. And the same thing would hold true for a group of people who are in Community C. A separate group, they go to the dock, they go to their area on the island, they have interactions with each other, but Community C does not have interaction with Community B, Community A, or anybody else who's on the isolated portion of the island. Now the question might come up, okay Keith, what does this story right here about the island have to do with private VLANs? And the answer is, this is an example of how private VLANs operate. Let's take a look at the mechanics of this for a moment. The reason it's called private VLANs, plural, is because we're using multiple VLANs to pull this off. We're going to have a primary VLAN. In this example, it's the island itself. Let's say it's VLAN 100. That's the primary VLAN. And associated with the primary VLAN is going to be some type of an IP network address space. So let's say that primary VLAN 100 is given the IP address space of 10.40.50.0/24. That's the subnet address space associated with that primary VLAN. Then we're going to create additional subsets, if you will, of that primary VLAN, subdomains. They refer to these in private VLANs as secondary VLANs. And so what we could do is we could create something called an isolated secondary VLAN. Or we could create one or more community VLANs as secondary VLANs. So as an example, the isolated VLAN may be VLAN 200. And community A VLAN may be VLAN 300. And community B may be VLAN 400. And C might be VLAN 500. So you see when they talk about private VLANs, it's actually one primary VLAN and then one or more secondary VLANs associated with that primary. Now these secondary VLANs can be one of 2 types. So they can be isolated or a community VLAN. For isolated, you can have only one isolated VLAN. And that's because all you really need is one isolated VLAN. Any ports that we put into VLAN 200 in this example, because it's an isolated VLAN, those devices that we connect to any isolated port are going to be completely isolated from any other devices in the private VLAN, with the exception of this port right here, which I labeled as the dock in our analogy. Every port in private VLANs is going to have access to the dock. And why do they need access to the dock? It's so they can get in and out of this VLAN environment. And we'll take a closer look at this dock port here in just a moment. With community VLANs, you can create more than just one. If you want to have 5 or 6 or 7 different community VLANs because you have 5 or 6 different customers that all want to have interaction with other devices from that same company, you simply create a new VLAN one for each community. And then what happens is we're going to associate VLAN 300 and VLAN 400 and VLAN 500 with the primary VLAN of 100 for two basic reasons. Number one, they're also going to need access to the dock so they can get in and out of the VLAN. And devices that are in Community C, which is VLAN 500, won't have access to other devices in VLAN 400, which is Community B, because there's no cross-community communications inside private VLANs. So if a host, for example, is connected to this port right here in VLAN 500, this device could communicate with this port, that port, and the dock, and that's it. This host cannot communicate with anybody in Community B, Community A, and of course no one who's connected to any isolated port of any type. So what are the port types? Well, if we have a port that's associated with a community, that would be a community port. So that's a community port for Community A, community port, community port, community port. In Community B, all the ports associated with Community B would be community ports for Community B. And the same thing for Community C. All the ports associated with Community C in VLAN 500 in our example are community ports for that community. An isolated port is any port that's associated with your isolated VLAN. So for example, here we have VLAN 200, which we've identified as being isolated. Any port on the switch that's associated with VLAN 200, the isolated VLAN, is not going to have the opportunity to communicate with anybody except for the dock, which gives that port the ability to, forward packets to its default gateway to get off the network, but it won't have access to any other ports in VLAN 200, which is the isolated VLAN. It won't have access to any other ports there, and it of course won't have access to any of the ports or devices connected to the ports in any of the other communities that are part of the private VLAN. Now, what in the world is this promiscuous port? The promiscuous port is the dock. That's the port or ports on the switch that are associated with the primary VLAN, in this case VLAN 100, and they call it the promiscuous port. I'll put a big P here because it's willing to talk with anybody. It'll be willing to talk to devices in isolated VLAN, in Community A, Community B, Community C, whatever communities you have in that private VLAN setup. The promiscuous port says, hey, I'm willing, I'll talk to anybody. And that's important because everybody on this network does need a default gateway, and it's very likely that connected to that dock is going to be our default gateway that the clients can use. So everybody who's connected to any of these ports is going to have the IP address that starts with 10.40.50. something. They'll be in that subnet. The default gateway will also be in that same subnet. And the whole purpose of the private VLANs is controlling who can talk to who inside of that subnet on that switch. And that control is implemented through the mechanism of private VLANs. And it's time for our assessment check. Take a moment, read through these questions. We'll be back to check them together in just a few moments. Good luck. All right, question number 1. Which port or ports can an isolated port communicate with? The answer is an isolated port can communicate only with a promiscuous port. That's it. And it's very likely off of that promiscuous port, we're going to have our default gateway that's sitting out there to get us off of the local network if we need to. Question number 2 is a true or false. A common subnet is shared between isolated and community VLANs. Now, the word that's a little bit misleading, I suppose, is shared, but in the big picture, the entire private VLAN scheme is sharing a single subnet. So even though ports in community and isolated VLANs cannot communicate directly with each other, they are still sharing a layer 3 common IP addressing scheme. And question number 3, private VLANs enforce traffic flow at which layer? 1, physical, 2, data link, or 3, at the network layer? And the answer to that is they are indeed private VLANs, and VLANs are enforcing layer 2 domains. And that's how a private VLAN is actually keeping the traffic separate, by doing it at layer 2 on the switch that's supporting private VLANs. So we may have a need to have one common subnet, but at the same time enforce separation of various traffic from various ports. And we can now do that using the tool of private VLANs. Hey, I appreciate you joining me in this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.